Good morning, everybody, and welcome to everyone here at Queen's Park and to those of you who are joining us online. First of all, I think it's very important to acknowledge that this land is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and my colleagues and I are grateful to live and to work on this land. I am here today to report on my office's investigation of severe delays and backlogs at the Landlord and Tenant Board. This was a lengthy, complex, and very challenging investigation that uncovered multiple systemic problems, which were only exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. The purpose of administrative tribunals like the Landlord and Tenant Board is to provide the public with a swift, accessible way to resolve disputes instead of going to court. We found that it was anything but. L'objectif des tribunaux administratifs comme la commission.
The purpose of these tribunals, such as the Landlord and Tenant Board, is to provide a swift and accessible way to solve disputes instead of going to courts. We have found that it wasn't the case. For the Landlord and Tenant Board,
was failing to meet its own service standards. After March 2020, its already shaky foundation toppled as it struggled to shift to virtual hearings and cope with a moratorium on evictions. The result was not just a litany of bureaucratic failures like adjudicator shortages, scheduling nightmares, and dysfunctional technology. What was most disturbing was how these delays affected real people on both sides of the landlord and tenant relationship. We heard from more than 4,000 people in the course of this investigation, and their stories were extremely compelling. Nous avons entendu les récits de plus de 4,000 personnes.
We have heard stories from over 4,000 people, and their stories were very concerning.
Living with harassment or deplorable, unsafe conditions for months or even years on end. And then there were property owners who faced financial ruin while they waited for hearings about tenants who were abusive, caused damage, or refused to pay rent. Many were trapped in the board's seemingly endless queue, no matter how urgent their situation. Some were sent to the back of the line because of errors in their applications. Others were left in limbo because their adjudicator had too many cases or might have just left the board. They were not only denied swift administrative justice to which they were entitled, they were denied basic fairness. Ces personnes n'ont pas seulement.
These people faced injustice in terms of administration, which represented their rights, but they were also denied of fairness.
These people that came forward to tell us their stories and allowed us to tell their stories, they remind us all that administrative backlogs affect real people who deserve public services that help them, not hurt them. Now, we helped many of these people resolve their individual issues, but their stories also helped us identify numerous solutions to help the board return to its proper function. This is an important function of my office. We do not just report on problems. We recommend workable solutions based on the evidence that we find and our expertise in government systems. Nous avons également identifié.
We have also identified many issues with public hearings, orders, and French decisions. Our unit in the French language services has been able to resolve many issues and add more personal staff. But there are still a lot of backlogs when adjudicators are not available.
Orders and decisions in French. Our French language services unit was able to help resolve many of these cases, and the board has since added more bilingual staff. However, there are still some needless delays because bilingual adjudicators are not always available. So I've made 61 recommendations to ensure that the board has a solid complement of adjudicators, including bilingual ones, and a case management system that can triage urgent cases, among other improvements. J'ai fait 61 recommandations.
I have offered 61 recommendations so that the landlord can have enough adjudicators as well as bilingual ones. I have also recommended that the system of handling cases make in effect a triage system.
Ontario, on behalf of the board, have accepted my recommendations and made a commitment to report back to me on their progress in implementing them. I want to stress that this system badly needs an overhaul so that it can do what it is meant to do: help landlords and tenants resolve disputes quickly and fairly by providing access to justice. The government has already announced that it is investing $6.5 million to appoint 40 more adjudicators, as well as more staff to the board. This is very welcome news, and I urge it to act quickly. As we document in this report, it takes a significant amount of time to recruit, appoint, and train board members. And this positive initiative should not be hampered by further delays. These additional adjudicators will require support staff, and I urge the government to ensure that they are provided. As this report demonstrates, the board, Tribunals Ontario, the ministry, and the government of Ontario must all work together to restore administrative justice to landlords and tenants across the province. Comme le montre ce rapport,
As it is shown, the ministry and the government of Ontario, the Ontario Land Tribunal, must work together to reinstate justice for landlord and tenants everywhere in the province.
these recommendations, Ontario landlords and tenants will finally get the service and fairness from the board that they deserve. Je répondrai maintenant à vos questions. I'm happy.
I will now answer your questions.
Sur les services en français,
In relations to French services, there's been shown that there's no data in terms of handling those cases. Can you tell us more about that? Reply: there's a lack of bilingual staff to mediate those hearings. And in my exchanges with the board, they were committed to resolve these issues, to not receive any complaints, so that they can handle those cases in French. It is part of our recommendations. They have been accepted, and we will follow up. Question: do you know how long it takes for a Francophone who wants to access services to be served by the board? Reply: unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you about that.
when you were able to schedule a hearing with the Landlord Tenant Board within days, now it being months, even years. Do you think under the current system, with the other changes that have been made, going fully electronic, et cetera, that it can go back to those kinds of timelines?
Well, we're hopeful. We're hopeful. It's got to be accessible and it's got to be timely to be fair and to offer justice. I think when you look at what's in the report and take an overview of the evidence that we've provided, if you have 80,000 applications a year and you have 35 or 40 people who are in various stages of their appointment, they may be leaving, they may be new, and a really complicated 122-step process to appoint new people, and it takes time to train. Then you impose a pandemic on top of that, and then you have precarity in election situations. That's the perfect storm that we described. And so the ministry and Tribunals of Ontario have committed to me to undertake the implementations of these recommendations. And so to answer your question, yes, I think it will make a difference. And I think that it will improve access to justice, and it will decrease the waiting times.
And based on what you learned in your investigation, do you have a sense of how long it'll take to get back to that point?
Well, I can't estimate how long. Some of these things take a while to implement. There may end up being some legislative changes and regulations to improve the appointment process. We'll see how it rolls out. What I can tell you is that we will follow up on this and get regular feedback and regular reports back on progress, and we'll continue to report on it in our annual reports as to how it's going.
Your report says that the average time to schedule a landlord application is 6 to 9 months. The average time to schedule a tenant application is 2 years. Was anybody able to offer an explanation for that discrepancy, and was that answer acceptable to you?
Well, I think, first of all, you have to realize that about 90% of the applications are from landlords, and that's the volume. And so there have been different strategies. What we saw was that there were different strategies to try and attack the backlog. And sometimes they said, well, let's deal with the evictions ones first. And it was kind of like a fire department let's put out the small fires first before we go tackle the big ones, so the small ones don't turn into big ones. And then things changed. And so there were, I think, as we say in the report, there were a there was a sliding scale of different approaches and priorities and strategies to try and get a grip on this. But I think what it came down to fundamentally was a lack of human resources, outdated technology, a slow appointment process, and that led to things like those delays in processing applications. And I can say there was no monopoly on hardship in this case, either on the landlord side or on the tenant side. I mean, we heard people going through horrible situations as a result of these delays. And so that's where we're very anxious to finish this investigation, to submit the recommendations, and very pleased that they've been accepted. And now we'll monitor the implementation.
I mean, tenant advocates have noted this discrepancy in the past and have argued that it shows a pro-landlord bias at the tribunal. That's not the case.
Well, we didn't see any evidence of a bias. What we saw was people trying to address when the backlog went from 20,000 to almost double 38,000 during the pandemic, and there was a moratorium on evictions. I think what we saw was people doing their best to address the situation and get as many cases dealt with as they could. And so, 90% of the cases are landlords. Sometimes they were looking for low-hanging fruit in cases that would be easy to resolve so that they could get them resolved. But we saw no evidence of a bias.
Monsieur Dubé, est-ce que vous pouvez nous parler un peu plus?
Mr. Dubé, can you tell us what is the human impact of this report? You've talked about prejudice, assault, dangerous situations. Can you tell us a little more about what you felt following your report? Reply. We've noticed that in certain cases, those delays have troubled people's lives. People who wanted to use their own housing to take care of their loved ones, for people who are affected by an illness, or landlord who were subject to assault, landlord who had tenants who had illegal businesses in their properties, or were subject to assault, sometimes with a knife. So people were victims, and it is crucial to have access to justice and to have an order from the board. And in many cases, it wasn't possible because of these delays. It's not only a data matter, but it's also an impact. It's also about the impact on people's lives. That is why it is crucial to have access to justice. Question: how long does it take for someone who's been threatened by a knife to continue to live under those conditions for months, where their lives are in danger? Reply: that is why it is part of our report or recommendation to do a triage to figure out who needs immediate solutions.
The stories that really compelled you.
Absolutely, and I alluded to that in my remarks, that this is not just statistics and bureaucratic backlogs that clog up filing cabinets. I mean, these have a real impact on people's lives. We had landlords that found their tenants conducting illegal activities. Some of them were harassed or threatened, attacked by their tenants, and some faced financial ruin because the rents weren't being paid, and some of them ended up in homeless shelters or living in their cars. On the other side of the equation, you had tenants that were living in deplorable conditions that couldn't get rent reductions or couldn't get repairs done and couldn't get the justice that they needed from the board to remedy these horrific situations. So, as I said earlier, there was no monopoly of suffering and hardship on either side of the equation. It was terrible conditions all around, and I think, as I read this morning, the comment that the one thing that landlords and tenants do have in common is that they deserve to have a better system to rectify these situations.
You said in the report that the board is fundamentally failing in its role of providing swift justice. If you could sum up, what were the reasons why it's fundamentally failing?
Well, it's the conditions that I alluded to when I referred to the perfect storm. I mean, if you got 80,000 applications a year and you have 35 or 40 people who are in various stages of employment. You know, some are leaving, some are coming in, some are not fully trained yet. And there's all of a sudden a moratorium on evictions, and then you have to transition to virtual hearings because your offices are shut down because of the pandemic. Outdated technology, right? The case management system couldn't flag urgent cases. There were difficulties with access to French language services, where if the applicant submitted an application, there was no way to, the respondent might have been a francophone and needed French language service. So there were a lot of glitches there that we've all identified and made recommendations to address. So it's the sum of all those things that have led to this moribund state of the board. And again, another factor was the transition of governments in 2018, and I don't think it's a political issue. I don't blame a new government for having to find its way and getting the lay of the land. I blame a system that was so precarious that a slight delay like that, or even a considerable delay, made it so that the work wasn't getting done at the board. The Landlord and Tenant Board should not have been in that precarious a situation before an election or afterwards.
And so it wasn't really just the pandemic. This was clearly before that. Yeah.
You're absolutely right. There was a backlog of 20,000 cases before the pandemic, but it almost doubled to 38,000 during the pandemic. But it was fragile before the pandemic, and we got a few complaints. I think it was in the 400s the year before. But since we launched our investigation, we got over 4,000 complaints. And it was, I think, a testament to the difficulties that people were hearing. And so we're very grateful that they came forward and allowed us to tell those stories and demonstrate the problems from both sides. Right? I think that's more compelling than one side telling their story. When you have both stories combined and the impact with feasible recommendations for solutions, I think that's how we're going to move forward.
What's unclear to me, though, is that you've acknowledged the government has put more money into the board. There have been quite a significant increase in the number of adjudicators there, but the backlogs hasn't really come down. So what's the current state of the situation right now?
Well, I don't have the stats for this month or this week, but what I know is that the new adjudicators are being hired, they're being trained, they're being brought in. It'll take a while. I assume it'll take a while for these changes to take effect. But I'm urging the government to do it as quickly as possible and to make sure that those new adjudicators have the support staff they need as well, so that it's an effective exercise of bolstering the complement. So actually, they're going to double the complement of adjudicators, right? Go from 35, 40 to almost 80. So if those people are trained up, and they've made some big investments on the technology already, and the case management system, they've been working on it for years. So those new changes are starting to take hold, and scheduling and flagging of cases, I'm led to understand, is improving now. So things are heading in the right direction, and we'll have to wait and see, but we'll be following up on this and monitoring it regularly.
Do you expect things to get worse before they start getting better?
No, I don't. I think that, they're bringing on new people, the technology is being updated. No, I'm expecting things to start getting better if these recommendations are applied and implemented in a timely fashion. And that's why I'm urging the government to move quickly and make sure that there are no delays in appointing these new 40 adjudicators.
Was the board inadequately funded for many years? Is that part of the problem, is that there just weren't enough staff to deal with it?
Well, there weren't enough staff because I think the assessment was made that they didn't need more. I don't know whether it was so much a funding thing. It's just they didn't have the bodies, they didn't have the allocation of people. I think that shortcoming has been recognized now. It's being addressed. And I'm encouraged to see that. And but
Who made that assessment?
I
Who decided that they didn't need more bodies?
that they did need more
That they
bodies.
didn't.
Well, I don't know if
Somebody
anybody
made
I don't know if
the
anybody
choice that they
decided.
didn't need more staff. Who decided that?
I don't know anybody at one point said they didn't need more staff. I think that what happened was, as the backlogs grew, and it's a reporting relationship that the executive chair goes to the Attorney General and says, we need more people. The government has responded by allocating $6.5 million. We'll give you 40 more people. So that's happened.
So it's a systemic failure for multiple governments then?
Sure. Yeah. I would say, like I said earlier, it was in bad shape before the election. The election and the stalling of appointing people made things worse and increased the backlog. And so, it was already in shaky situation in 2020 before the pandemic. But when the pandemic hit, and they had to go to virtual hearings and trying to provide access to justice to people who may not have had a computer, who may not have had a cell phone, and they tried. They did a lot of things, but I think the whole system was overwhelmed.
Vous dites dans votre rapport que vous parlez d'une commission moribonde.
Question. What does it look like? Should we remove everything and start from the beginning? Reply. If we increase the amount of adjudicators, if we renew the technology, if we offer enough support, we will be in a good position. But we must act swiftly. Question. Why did you decide to launch your investigation right now and not in 2020 or 2021? Reply. It depends on the number of complaints that we receive and systemic problems as well, and that's the only reply that I can offer you. Question. I know that you don't have a specific answer, but when we have these delays, how long will it take to resolve them? How can we move forward quickly? Reply. It depends on the strategy to use their new members, their new staff members, how long it'll take to update the technology. I cannot predict or forecast anything. I just hope that things will move better. Question. Are you already encouraged by how your recommendations were received? Reply. Yes, through my exchanges with the CEO, the minister, they have committed themselves to implement those recommendations. They are looking for solutions as well. And it is rare to find problems that the board isn't already aware of. A lot of time it's a lack of manpower or will, and by shining the light on these matters, more often positive changes will come afterward, and I hope that that will be the case if those recommendations are implemented swiftly.
Fundamental of an overhaul is needed. You say it's fundamentally failing at what it is supposed to be doing. How fundamental does the overhaul actually need to be?
Well, the question in French was, should they just tear it down and rebuild it? And I don't, that's not what we're recommending. I think that if you ensure that there's an adequate number of properly trained and securely employed adjudicators that have adequate support staff and are supported with technology that can alleviate the load and drive some efficiencies, and you have a plan for election years, and you have adequate resources to ensure French language services, I think that it's improvements rather than blowing up and rebuilding that can get us there to where we want to be.
And you mentioned the recent announcement about doubling the number of adjudicators. You mentioned as well that this has been a years-long problem. This is something your office has been investigating for quite some time. Do you have a sense of what tipped the scales on why that announcement is coming now, years into the problem?
Well, I think, quite often when we start an investigation, we started seeing improvements, right? And we see improvements as soon as we launch an investigation, because at the end of the day, departments and agencies and ministries want to be able to say, we're already on it and we've heard it, and things are not as bad as they were when the Ombudsman started the investigation, and that's fine. That's part of the process. And so, we've seen action taken. We've seen there was an investment. I can't remember how many years ago it started, but the investment in technology started a while ago, and it's increasing and being maintained, and so that's good. So I think that if what we're trying to do is offer solutions to problems based on evidence, evidence-based solutions. And I think our recommendations do that. They've been taken very seriously, and both the executive chair and the deputy attorney general thanked me on behalf of my team for the really thorough and fair and detailed report that we did. And so they appreciate that. It's helpful for them. It's helpful for them to hear what the experiences of citizens are, but also to be provided with evidence-based solutions, and that's what we do.
Your report says you want to hear back on progress in 6 months. What are some of the things that absolutely must be done by 6-month mark? Like, what recommendations need to be completed?
Well, we don't have a fixed timeline on any of the recommendations because, you know, some things may need regulation or legislative change. Other things, you know, it's as I can tell you from personal experience, it's not easy to hire people in Toronto. It's not easy to find human resources, and it's even harder to find bilingual human resources in Toronto. So it's a challenge that even my office has. So things take time. What I want to see is movement. What I want to see is progress. And so, you know, we're seeing that with the investment. We're seeing that with the recruitment of these new adjudicators. I am saying that it's not enough just to hire adjudicators, though they need support staff. So I'm hoping and I'm urging, you know, the government to ensure that they have that support. And we've seen some pretty big investments. I don't have the dollar figures, but I know there's been big investment in the technology and the case management system. So I'm encouraged. Like, things are moving in the right direction, and I'm hoping to see the delays go down and the backlogs go down in the fairly near future.
Can't give us any kind of reasonable milestones that we could judge the progress on in 6 months?
Well, in 6 months, we'll see what they're working on. In the 6 months, we'll see, and then when our annual report comes up, we'll do an update on our annual report. Yeah, we'll keep people posted.
We're going to the phone line.
Good.
We do have a question on the phone from Jessica Smith-Cross from Trillium. Please go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much for taking my question. I was just wondering if you were able to tell what the impact of the switch to virtual hearings has been in terms of the board's efficiency.
Well, it's a tough question because for some people, you know, it might have made things a little bit more easier and more accessible, but then for a lot of people, it just made a hearing and an access to justice inaccessible because they didn't have access to technology or computers. I know that the board, for some people, you know, was providing phones or setting up monitors and stations where they could log in, but that was fraught with glitches and problems. So it was a challenge. It was a challenge.
That was it. Thank you so much. It's been really helpful.
Anybody else on the phones? Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Merci tout le monde.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.